my talk today is focused on forecasting outbreaks of PEDv. So just to give you a brief recap of what has happened with PEDv in the U.S. swine industry, and I think most of this audience is familiar with the story of PED, but this virus is a virus that has tremendous impact on the industry, primarily through its effect on neonatal mortality, with mortality rates of 50 to 100%. And even then, it takes up to 12 weeks to really, for these farms to recover their baseline levels of piglet production. And even within surviving piglets that have recovered from PEDv generally don't do very well in the growing period. Now, as most of us here know, this is a virus that was previously absent from North America. It appeared in 2013, imported over from China, and it spread very rapidly throughout the country. So within 8 months, it was in 23 states, 2,500 farms, and it's been blamed for at least in this initial period, upwards of 7 million deaths of piglets. And so this is a graphic from the Swine Health Monitoring Project. Here's that initial epidemic wave that happened with PED. And then now the virus has kind of settled into more of an endemic nature in the country. So one of the areas of research that has happened is to focus on how has this virus been able to spread between farms so rapidly, particularly in this early period. And there's several mechanisms proposed for between farm spread. The first is animal movements. We know that if you're moving infected pigs around, then you're moving virus around. We know this from looking at within single flows and how the virus moves around. But we can also look at more macro levels of animal movements and animal flows through the country and map that onto how the virus spread. The second mechanism of between farm spread is what we call local area spread. This includes things like wind-borne transmission, which is somewhat controversial, but we do know that viral particles can disperse via airborne mechanisms. We also use this classification of transmission to account for anything that operates on a local level that we don't really measure. So this can be things like shared equipment, shared personnel, moving between farms, anything that you expect that the risk of transmission is higher when farms are closer together than when they're farther apart. So this includes all those types of spread. The third mechanism, actually we'll put these ones together, are contaminated equipment and vehicles. So trucks moving to and from. This is especially an issue, or it's been mentioned a lot, for the movement of market trucks to and from slaughter facilities. And then contaminated feed. So these are the primary mechanisms that have been proposed and that have at least some support for how the virus moves around. So we did some modeling work with a computational simulation model to try to further understand the spread of PED. And this model was based on the early emergence of PED, so this kind of epidemic phase of the disease. But what we found that if we started putting all of these different transmission modes into one model and trying to understand what or how frequent should these different modes of transmission be for us to produce a realistic looking epidemic that looked like what we saw in 2013 and 2014, we find that in this case, local area spread, and animal movements accounted for something around 75% of the transmission events between farms. Not to say that the other mechanisms weren't important. They were important, but they seem to be rarer, but may be responsible for more long-distance jumps. So based on this analysis, we can kind of conclude that the primary components of infection risk, at least for between farms, largely rely on animal movements. We know that the connectivity of animal movement networks influences the spread of disease. And spatial dependence. So this is our local area spread, but there's a large number of other environmental variables that contribute to how likely we would expect a virus to be able to survive in the environment long enough to disseminate to another farm. So some of the other activities going on right now in relation to PED and other endemic diseases is an attempt to actually start monitoring these viruses in our breeding population in the U.S. So Most of you probably have heard of the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project, which is a University of Minnesota-based project that monitors roughly 50% of the U.S. sow population. And it is all based on voluntary participation by production companies and systems that report on a weekly basis which of their farms are infected with PED. We also know where these farms are. In some cases, we have additional data on them. The program also operates for PRRS and some other diseases, but we'll talk mainly about PED here. So the goal of this program is to really conduct long-term epidemiological monitoring and research. So this is the type of data that we're getting. This is in particular the incidence curve for PRRS, not PED. So one of the things that we've done in our research is to ask, can we use all of this rich spatial temporal data from these retrospective databases to actually predict future risks of outbreaks? So we've talked a little bit about different components that we expect to contribute to between-farm transmission. And we take all of this data. We have our outbreak data from M-Shimp, pig movements, spatial data, environmental data. We take all of these types of data and feed them into our analytical pipeline to actually get some sort of information that can inform action. So the goal of this project, therefore, is to quantify and dynamically predict the risk of PED outbreaks in the sow farms. Just to give you an idea of the approach that we take to do this, if we take a landscape here, imagine this triangle is our sow farm. And around that sow farm, we draw a buffer. And the buffer is 5 kilometers radius in any direction, and we call that the neighborhood of the sow farm. And within that neighborhood, we have the location of other farms. These farms may be other sow farms. They may be nurseries. They may be finishers. If they're sow farms and they're in M-Shimp, we also know their infection status as well. Other data that we include in this model is animal movements. So we include not only the animal movements into the focal farm itself, but we include the movements into the neighboring farms. So the idea here is that if your neighbor is moving in lots of pigs, that would increase the probability that you would have an introduction of the virus into your local neighborhood. And then once it's in your neighborhood, then we could have some sort of local area spread going on that would allow that virus to move from the neighbor to your farm. And that would be expected to be influenced by environmental factors, land use factors, and other things that have been implicated in other risk factor analyses as important for infection risk. So this gives you an idea of what this process looks like on a landscape. So this is a map that's kind of a weekly time lapse of which farms are infected with PED. So each of these circles represents a neighborhood around a sow farm. The color of the circle, so the red ones are the ones that during that week were positive for PED. And then the lines that you see are the flows of pigs between the different neighborhoods. So this is essentially the process that we're actually trying to model and be able to predict. So we feed all of the data that we just discussed, we feed that into machine learning models. I won't talk too much in detail about those here. But the key here is that we're building predictive models that we call our forecasting models, and we're validating them. And one of the ways that we validate them is that we don't use all of our data to build the model. We reserve some of the data away from the model building process so that we can test the model on new data, so that we can try to validate and make sure our model is performing with accuracy. So the types of outputs that we get from this, this is called a variable importance plot. Essentially, these are all of our potential predictors that are included in the model, and they are ranked in terms of the most important to the least important. So the size of the bar is a measure of how important that variable was in predicting whether or not an outbreak occurred. So the things I want to highlight here is the things that come up as the most important in predicting outbreaks is the status of origin for movements coming into the sow farm. So if you're moving in pigs from an infected source, then your risk of an outbreak increases. Now that's not surprising. We're glad the model can capture that. But that is something that we would certainly like the model to be able to capture. If it wasn't predicting that, we might be concerned. Other things that come up as important are the status of the the PED status of the origin of movements coming into the neighboring farms. So now we're saying that, okay, if your neighbors are moving pigs in from an infected source, that increases your risk. So that's interesting to capture. And then other things that you see come up as a high rank in terms of their importance and prediction are the hog density. So that's the density of farms. And then this is temperature, which is probably capturing aspects of seasonality. And so these numbers here represent the accuracy or the performance of the model. So our forecasting model, the current iteration, performs with a 70% positive predictive value. So if you remember from your epi days, positive predictive value means how confident is the model in your results. So a 70% positive predictive value means that when the model says, yes, there's going to be an outbreak, 70% of the time it is right. There was actually an outbreak. Now, the other value that's probably important here is the sensitivity, which is 20%. Sensitivity means that, well, of all the outbreaks that actually occurred, our model, our forecasting model, only flagged 20% of those. So we're not catching all of the outbreaks. We're only catching about 20% of them with this system. And of course, there's a trade-off between the ability to flag or to provide that warning of an outbreak and whether or how many false positives, how many false alarms are we generating. So there's a big trade-off in how many false alarms are there going to be relative to how many do we catch. So that's one of the reasons that the sensitivity is, well, we'll call it moderate, 20%. And we've talked a little bit to the companies that are participating in this pilot project. And they're still excited about this because this is information that previously we had no information on, and it was just a complete unknown. So the fact that we're catching at least some of the outbreaks, and the outbreaks that we do catch, we're fairly confident, yes, those are going to happen. We feel pretty confident about that and excited about that. All right, so some of the things that we're doing to facilitate making the system sustainable is to build a software pipeline that actually performs all of the analysis behind these forecasts in an automated fashion, because we don't want to be in a situation where we have to have a grad student or a postdoc sitting crunching numbers every single week so we can actually produce forecasts every single week for our participants. So what this forecasting pipeline essentially does is that wraps it all in a nice software program that inputs new data, and then we get to the forecasts at the end of the pipeline. So some of the inputs that are important here is we need a list of farms. So the list of farms that are in the area. That does include all the sow farms, but we also include all of the other downstream types of farms in our model because that's contributing to the spatial risk to the sow farm as well as to the animal movements. So this includes the premise ID, the production type of the farm, and the GPS location. Other things that we include in the model, and this is, again, data that needs to be streamed from our participants, is animal movement data, which is essentially just a spreadsheet where we have the origin of movements, the destination of movements, the date at which it occurred, the number of head that were moved, and then the type of movement, which is like weaned pigs or fattening pigs or gilts. And that's essentially just a spreadsheet. So that's something else that feeds into the model. And then the last thing we use is the outbreak data, so the updated MSHMP infection status that we can pull directly from the MSHMP database. The colors that you see here flickering on and on off is just a way that we help record keep within our pipeline to make sure that we're accurately making sure that all of the processes are happening. So the beige color means everything's great, up to date, nothing needs to be done. We don't need to run any particular module. Each of these are squares and diamonds are associated with a particular data processing step that happens, that goes on behind the scenes. But importantly, the purple represents modules or coding sections that need to be rerun. So that means if it comes up purple, that means something has changed previously in the pipeline. Probably there's new data in the pipeline. We need to rerun that part of the pipeline to make sure that we get it up to date and that we get our forecast out at the end. All right, so how is this actually going to work when we roll this out in real time? because we've been kind of in the R&D phase for a while, and now we're actually getting to the point that this fall we're going to start trying to be producing these forecasts on a weekly basis for our participating region. So if we imagine that we're here at week 0, that's what the day that we're performing our analysis. The analysis that we run today is for 2 weeks from now. So we're making our forecast for 2 weeks in the future from today. The things that are important in this is we use the previous week's movement, so all the way back to about 4 weeks ago, we put that and include that in our model. But importantly, we also use scheduled animal movements for the next week. The reason that we do this, we understand that the scheduled movements can change, but if we don't include these, then our predictive accuracy does decline substantially. So we need to include those movements, and the only way that we can do that to give enough of a lead time, a 2-week lead time on our forecast, is to include these scheduled movements. If we only use the previous data, and we could use all of the data up till now and make a prediction for right now, but that's a little bit too late to be a forecast. We need to be producing these forecasts in enough time in advance so that the information can be delivered to our participants and that they actually might have time to respond. So that's one reason that we use these scheduled movements and plan for a 2-week in the future forecast. All right, so what does this actually look like? The idea is that each company or each system that's participating would receive a list, a private list of only their farms and the probability that each of their sow farms would break, which is shown here. We have de-identified farm IDs here, and then we have the probability of break. This is looking at the same type of data. These are all farms across the x-axis. The y-axis is the PED outbreak probability. And basically, this is looking at a specific week and the probability that each farm would break. And we do see, some variation with, these 2 farms over here for this particular week were predicted at being the highest risk. We can look at this data different ways that provides additional insights. Here now we're looking at about 10 different sow farms, and now this is their weekly probability of breaking throughout this past summer. So this is their 29 predictions. It's interesting to see the temporal variation in that some weeks you see certain farms pop up based on probably some animal movements that were probably going on in that week. So it's kind of interesting to look at this across time. And then this is the same type of data. Now we're looking across space. So this is the map of risk. So each of these dots represents a farm. How red it is or how bright it is represents its risk. And then we're looking at the risk predicted in the last week of the month for June, July, and August. So that's June, July, and August 2019. So again, we see spatial variation. And for example, and this is the last week of August, we see this farm in particular and maybe this farm are the highest risk farms that particular week. For the data that we're presenting here, this is summertime. For those of you that are in the PED world, summertime is not really the highest risk part of the year for transmission of viruses in swine. So all of these, we're going up to about a 15% risk here over the summer. We would still consider that, relatively low risk. It's really when we get up to predictions that get around 36% and above that we start being like, okay, yes, this is something that we would flag more strongly as, yes, this is a high-risk farm for this week. But it does give you an idea of what this looks like and how this might evolve into when we get into more of the high transmission period this fall and winter. All right, so a question we get a lot with this work is, well, can we expand to other diseases? For example, PERS. The answer is yes, but we have tried it with PERS. PERS has proved quite a bit more challenging. We do see the same types of variables come up as being important in predicting PERS breaks, such as the PERS status of origins of movements both into the sow farm in question, but also into its neighbors. But our model doesn't perform with a lot of predictive power. And we think it's because PERS is a really different beast than PED. There's a lot of different things going on here. One is there's on-farm evolution. There's a lot of thoughts that a lot of breaks that we see of PERS are actually essentially re-breaks from viruses that were already on the farm and just not being detected. So they're not really a result of between-farm transmission processes, and that's what our model really captures. The other thing with PERS is that they're not all created equal. So there are numerous strains of PERS co-circulating at any time. Some may be more prevalent some years than others, and that's basically what this is showing. These are all farms in a specific region and which genetic subtype of PERS they had in a specific year. And you can see that it changes markedly over time. So if you have two farms that are both infected with PERS, it doesn't actually mean that those are epidemiologically related at all. Those might be completely different viruses. So that's one reason that we think PERS has been a little bit harder for us to actually predict. Then we talk about things like foreign animal diseases. Well, we could apply this. The pipeline is there. If we got a FMD or an ASF outbreak, we could do that because the way the data is structured in the MSHMP database, this is our infection and our outbreak data, as long as we structure the data in the same way, there's no reason that we couldn't apply this, although it might take some time for us to build up enough of a database to really have enough outbreaks occurring that we're able to build a predictive model. But yes, we probably could try to do that. All right, so limitations of our forecasting system. First is the data availability and timeliness. This is particularly important for the infection data and the movement data. So the movement data in particular is something that changes every week. We have to work with our systems pretty closely on how to actually transfer that data to us in a timely enough fashion for us to make forecasts. Because if they're giving us data that's already 3 months old, there's really not much we can do with that in terms of trying to forecast future risk. So what we're working with our systems right now is they actually send us a weekly data dump. Every Friday they email this to us, and depending on the system and how their own data is structured, that has a different level of investment from the system. I know that if you use, for example, MetaFarms, you can almost do this automatically and actually have no person involved. They can just generate the data query in an email, and no one really has to do anything. But not all systems have their movement data stored in that way. The other limitations that we have is I'm sure some of you are thinking that we have a lot of missing pieces. And yes, we do have missing pieces in what variables that we're using to make these forecasts. One of those is that we don't actually have much information about biosecurity or use of vaccination or other exposure protocols on these farms. And there was a lot of great talks in the other PERS session earlier this morning about how important biosecurity is, and probably different farms have different measures in place, and these are probably important. And unfortunately, we do not have those at this point in our model. We also don't have alternative modes of transmission, so this is really capturing mostly things about local area spread and animal movements, but would miss things probably that are related to feed, for example, or the movement of market trucks or feed trucks between farms. So we don't have those in our model at this point. The last part I wanted to talk about today is the sustainability and scalability of our system. I'll talk first about the sustainability. Well, I've already mentioned that one thing we're doing is actually putting all of our analytical pieces into a piece of software so that we don't need to have a highly trained data scientist on our team continuously to actually generate this data. We're going to put that into software and let the software do this, and that will both limit the expertise required to actually utilize it, but it'll also limit the personnel investment on our end on what it takes to actually generate this on a weekly basis. The other part about sustainability is we are focusing on data that is already routinely collected. So this is based on the KISS principle, which is keep it simple, stupid. And this gets back a little bit to why we don't have some of those alternative modes of transmission. A lot of that data is not routinely collected. We don't really have the routes that feed trucks are taking and the order of farms that they go to. Certainly, we could include that if the data existed, but it would be also on our systems and companies to actually continually collect that data and share it with us, which a lot of companies don't have that data, in a readily packaged Excel file of some sort to share us. So we really want to focus on data that we can continually update and is not going to put such a burden of participation just to keep the data up to date. So that's one reason that we've chosen to not try to be exhaustive in all transmission modes that we could possibly include, and then have systems get essentially the drag of the personnel and the labor to put the data together every week would just be too much. All right, the second piece I want to talk a little bit about is scalability. So I've mentioned that we've been working with a current set of participating systems on this. Well, what about expanding to new systems or new regions of the country that we're currently not working in? One of the great things about the software we're building is that we're building in automated onboarding, which means that if there's a new system that comes on, or new farms, or a new entire region that's not yet in our database, yes, we can incorporate them, and we're building it in such a way that we don't need to go back to a phase where in the research and development phase for a year or two with a postdoc and a data scientist trying to do the models. We're building that into our system so that this can be done in a more automated, more efficient fashion. The other thing that we're doing is within our pipeline is to have built-in model updating, because we acknowledge that the epidemiological situation on the ground is constantly changing. More data is being generated. The model that predicted really well 2 years ago may not be the best model to predict PED outbreaks next year. So we have a piece of our software that actually is going to essentially retrain and rebuild the models, say maybe every 3 to 6 months, so that we can make sure that our forecasting is continually evolving and adapting to the current context on the ground. All right, and in closing, the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do is to inform decision making on the ground. And to do this, as a recap, we are using animal movement data, spatial and environmental variables, with the goal of predicting risk or forecasting risk in near real time. And the idea here is that we're going to be able to provide advanced 2-week warning of the sow farms that are most at risk of breaking, and then that should allow our partners time to actually do any sort of prevention or mitigation measures to actually limit the impact of PED. Just here at the end, I just want to acknowledge the team that we work with, particularly Dr. Igor Poplawski, who's going to be talking in a few minutes, who's the postdoc on the project, Rahul Bojwani, who's also here today as our data scientist, who is a very important member of our team to make this happen, and then our funding from USDA and the Swine Health Information Center.